Hi everyone, we're going to be moving on now to chapter 10 of Jekyll and Hyde, and we're going to be splitting chapter 10 into two parts. We're going to look at chapter 10a and chapter 10b. Now that's primarily because chapter 10 is so long, there's not really any division in the narrative, it's just that it's an exceptionally long chapter, so it's easier to split into two segments. It's important to remember that we've just finished chapter 9 where we've had Dr. Lanyon's narrative, and this was read by Utterson sitting in his home after the death or the finding of the body of Mr. Hyde, and it appears that he's committed suicide. So we've had Dr. Lanyon's narrative, and now we're about to have Dr. Jekyll's narrative essentially. Chapter 10 is the full statement of the case, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case, and he basically explains from even being a young man right up until the moments before his death. He explains all the different facets of his investigations, of his scientific endeavours, and essentially what leads to him creating this dual identity of Jekyll and Hyde. So we can start by having a quick look at some of the key quotes together. There's not a lot of plot in terms of action because it's all taken place, but there's a lot of descriptions of why certain things have taken place in the past. Remember, this is almost like the final jigsaw piece that really completes the whole story and makes it much clearer for us all. The first key quote is when Jekyll is explaining his young manhood, his description of being someone who in society was well liked, well respected. He was born into like a well-established family with good money. He essentially says that everything in his life seemed to be moving him towards a direction of being a good and respectable Victorian gentleman. But he then describes a couple of things about his almost kind of like another side to him that he keeps hidden even from his family and his friends. And a couple of key quotes just to indicate that idea of secrecy and of a hidden other self even before the creation of Hyde. One key quote is he says, "Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look around me to take stock of progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity in life." So this idea of being duplicitous, this duplicity of having two senses of self. So "I concealed my pleasures" is a great quote because it highlights that even before thinking of creating someone like Hyde, he, as Jekyll, has a kind of dual nature to him. Moving on the same page, we have this idea of the shame that comes with this secrecy. He says, "I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame." So that awareness that he's doing something that society perceives to be wrong is indicated by a sense of shame. So he knows what he's doing is maybe not accepted, and he hides it, and that idea of secrecy leads to his shame. So this kind of tells us that even as a young man, Jekyll is someone who perhaps has a side to him that is maybe less desirable. He then continues to talk about, as he grows older and becomes a scientist, that he kind of perceives the possibility of splitting his identity or creating another sense of self. And he began to recognise what he calls, and this is the next great quote, the primitive duality of man. And this word primitive is really important. It means, or it links to the idea of being primal, of something deep within us all that's animalistic, that's very much to do with that word troglodytic from earlier on in the novel, like a kind of caveman idea, that deep within every one of us is a primitive nature, there's a duality. We are good, or we try to be good, but deep down in everyone there's a duality of good and evil. So he kind of recognises this even at a young age, and as a young scientist starts to push the boundaries of science to explore that. And by pushing the boundary of science, he gives into something, temptation. So there's a good quote on the next page where he talks about the temptation of a discovery, and he explains this discovery would be so tempting to try and push for. Now, this links back to what would commonly be known in Victorian era is the Christian story of Adam and Eve being tempted by the snake, the embodiment of the devil, to eat the apple from the tree of knowledge. So this temptation would have been well known by Christian Victorians, and he's playing on that idea that the temptation of greater knowledge is what drove him to essentially create Hyde and have this evil side to him. Then he begins to explain some of the kind of first dalliances with creating Hyde. And when he first creates Hyde, after taking the potion that he's concocted, he explains that he feels a certain way. This is the next quote. He says, "I felt younger and lighter happier in body. So after taking the potion for the first time, becoming Hyde, he feels younger, lighter and happier. Now, he then goes on to explain that his theory for this is that because as Jekyll, for years and years and years of his life until a young adult, he has suppressed his evil side, then when his evil side has came out, it's younger, it's lighter, it's happier, it's not a full adult yet. It creates itself in the personification of Hyde, embodiment of Hyde, smaller, deformed, less fully complete, but younger in spirit. And this is his theory that really because Hyde, or the side of Jekyll that is Hyde, has been kept down for so long, when it's actually given a body, it feels very youthful and alive. And then on the next page, we have that youth and that vibrance is translated directly into the sense of evil. So he says, Edward Hyde alone, in the ranks of all mankind, was pure evil. Now, to consider that for a moment, no other creature in the world has been created as such to be pure embodiment of evil. And that was quite a startling discovery that Jekyll made, that he could do such a thing. Then we have just the last kind of quote here for this half of the chapter. So I'm going to lead you up to really page 46, 47. And the final key quote for me is what Jekyll has, this kind of almost like a light bulb moment, a eureka moment. And he says, think of it, I did not even exist. And what he means is, I have created an individual who has no birth certificate, no records, no, what we might call like a national insurance number. He has no identity. Mr. Hyde doesn't exist. He's created him. And it's in that startling moment that Jekyll recognises the possibility of what he can do with that alter ego, with this other identity. If he doesn't exist, then there are no consequences. And Jekyll sees that as an opportunity to perhaps use Hyde to explore some of his hidden pleasures or hidden desires that he has. Now that's the first half of chapter 10. The second half, I've tried to kind of split it just as we have the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, which is about to come up. So everything up until then is really an exploration of why Jekyll decided to do it. And Jekyll was really just exploring the boundaries of science, and with the possibility of, if he could create a purely evil person, then perhaps he could make himself be purely good and control that evil in a much more structured way. We know eventually that doesn't end up being the case, and that in fact his evil side takes control, but that's what he intended in the first instance. So that's chapter 10A. Move on to chapter 10B in the next video. Thanks.